A small beggar saved a millionaire who was crossing the street without paying attention and gave. Snow fell silently on the empty streets of Manhattan, each flake a tiny crystal in the bitter December night. Through the swirling white, a man in an expensive coat hurried past a small figure huddled in a doorway. Neither knew that in moments their lives would intertwine in ways that would shake the foundations of both their worlds. The screech of bus brakes would pierce the winter silence. A moment of chaos would challenge everything they believed about life and death, and a choice made in desperation would reveal long-buried secrets that would change them forever. This story isn't just about survival, it's about redemption, sacrifice, and the price of true humanity in a world that had forgotten what that meant. Before we start, share where you're watching from. If you're new or haven't subscribed, please click subscribe, it means the world to us. Thanks. The cardboard box Ivy called home was tucked away in an alley behind Madison Avenue, a cruel irony as designer stores towered above her makeshift shelter. At 13, she had mastered the art of invisible living, knowing which restaurants threw away edible food, which doorways offered the best shelter from winter winds, and most importantly, how to avoid the pitying or disgusted glances of passers-by. Tonight, as snow crusted the edges of her box, she clutched her mother's worn photograph, its edges softened by countless touches. Sarah Martinez had been a housekeeper, working 2 jobs to keep them afloat until that fateful day last winter. The memories came flooding back, sharp as broken glass: her mother's wheezing cough, the emergency room's harsh fluorescent lights, and the administrator's cold voice: no insurance, no admission, hospital policy. They'd been turned away from 3 hospitals that night. By the time they found one that would take them, pneumonia had claimed her mother's life. The death certificate listed natural causes, but Ivy knew better. Her mother had died of indifference, of a system that valued profit over people. The streets became her home after that. Child services had tried to place her, but the foster homes felt like prisons. She'd run away 4 times before they stopped looking. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, she wondered if they'd ever really looked at all. School had been her sanctuary once. She'd been a bright student, always at the top of her class despite their circumstances. But that ended when someone's expensive phone went missing from the locker room. No evidence, no witnesses, just the immediate assumption that the poor kid must be the thief. The principal's words still echoed in her head: we can't risk having someone like you around other students. Now her education came from the street's harsh lessons in survival taught by empty stomachs and frozen fingers. She'd learned to read people instead of books, to calculate the odds of kindness in a stranger's face, to measure worth not in dollars but in the smaller currencies of human dignity: a smile, a kind word, a moment of being seen as human. The other street kids became her family. Little Maria, barely 7, who shared her corner of the alley. Tommy, who'd lost his leg to frostbite last winter but still managed to make them laugh. They pooled their resources, shared what little they had, protected each other as best they could against the city's casual cruelty. But lately, the burden of leadership weighed heavy on her young shoulders. Winter had come early this year, bitter and brutal. Food was scarcer, shelters were full, and the city's wealthy seemed to have developed an even stronger talent for looking through them as if they were ghost children, unfortunate shadows in their prosperous world. Last week, someone had posted a video of her being chased from a cafe. "Street rat gets served," the caption read, followed by laughing emojis. But she'd seen herself through their eyes: dirty clothes, matted hair, desperation etched on her face, and for the first time in months, she'd cried herself to sleep. Yet something in her refused to break. Her mother had taught her that dignity wasn't found in possessions, but in how you treated others. So each morning, Ivy would share her meager findings with the younger kids, offer comfort to the elderly homeless who'd been discarded by their families, and maintain a fierce hope that somehow, someday, things would change. What she didn't know, as she huddled in her box that snowy evening, was that change was coming. It would arrive in the form of a man who owned the very hospital that had turned her mother away, through a series of events that would challenge everything she believed about fate, forgiveness, and the true meaning of wealth. For now, though, she was just a hungry girl in a cardboard box, warming her hands with her breath, watching the snow fall on a city that had forgotten how to care. Marcus Sullivan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching snowflakes swirl against the Manhattan skyline. At 53, he had amassed a fortune that would last several lifetimes CEO of the largest private healthcare network in the city, with a net worth that made him a regular feature in Forbes. Yet as he stared at his reflection in the glass, all he saw was a man haunted by ghosts. The most persistent ghost was his sister, Claire. 20 years ago, she'd begged him to change the hospital policies to create more accessible healthcare for the poor. Money isn't everything, Marcus, she'd argued. These are people's lives we're dealing with, but he'd been younger then, ambitious, convinced that strict business practices were necessary for success. Their argument had ended with her storming out into a rainy night. The car accident that followed had left him as the sole Millionaire. Now, 2 decades later, his sister's voice still echoed in his empty mansion. He'd expanded the hospital network, made it more profitable than ever, but at what cost? Each denial of care form that crossed his desk carried the weight of potential consequences he chose not to consider. It was just business, he told himself. The system worked the way it worked. His personal assistant knocked softly, entering with a stack of papers. "The board meeting is in an hour, Mr. Sullivan. And your son's lawyer called again about the inheritance dispute." Ah yes, Richard, his adopted son from his brief marriage, now 30 and determined to secure his claim to the Sullivan fortune before any possible siblings might appear. The boy had his father's business acumen, but none of the conscience that occasionally troubled Sullivan. The latest lawsuit was aimed at preventing Sullivan from making any major donations or changes to his will. The isolation of wealth had become more apparent lately. His enormous dining room hosted no family dinners, just business meetings. His art collection, worth millions, drew no admiring glances except from potential buyers. Even his charitable donations, carefully calculated for maximum tax benefit, felt hollow. His phone buzzed with another message from the hospital board. They were concerned about his recent softening on payment policies. Last week, he'd approved emergency care for an uninsured patient, and the board saw it as a dangerous precedent. "We're not running a charity," the message reminded him. Looking down at the snowy street, Sullivan noticed a group of homeless people huddled in a doorway. Years ago, such a sight would have prompted him to call building security. Now, he found himself wondering about their stories. Was this what Claire had seen? The human cost of policies written in boardrooms by men like him? The weight of his Italian wool coat felt suddenly oppressive. He'd built his empire on the principle that healthcare was a business, not a right. Tough decisions make strong hospitals, he'd always said. But lately, doubt had crept in like the winter chill, subtle at first, then bone deep and impossible to ignore. His phone rang again, Richard's lawyer, no doubt with another threat about the inheritance. Sullivan let it go to voicemail. Instead, he picked up an old photograph from his desk. Claire at 25, her eyes bright with purpose, her whole life ahead of her. She'd been working on a proposal for a free clinic when she died. He'd found the draft among her things, pages filled with her passionate belief in healthcare for all. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Sullivan, the board is waiting." He straightened his tie, put on the mask of the confident CEO. But something had shifted, like the first crack in winter ice. That evening, he would make a decision that would change not just his life, but the lives of countless others. He didn't know it yet, but a small girl in a cardboard box would show him the way back to his humanity. For now, though, he was just another wealthy man in a tower, surrounded by everything money could buy, and haunted by the one thing it couldn't: redemption. Le Bernardin glowed like a jewel in the winter night, its warmth and opulence a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. Through its pristine windows, New York's elite dined on $100 entrees, their conversations a gentle murmur beneath crystal chandeliers. The restaurant had 3 Michelin stars and a 6-month waiting list, unless you were someone who mattered, and in this city, mattering was measured in bank balances and social influence. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees, and the wind cut like knives through insufficient layers of clothing. The homeless had already staked out the warmest vents and doorways, their political invisibility in direct proportion to their physical visibility on the streets. Social media influencers stepped around them carefully, phones raised to capture the restaurant's exclusive ambience without accidentally documenting society's failures. The maitre d' surveyed his domain with practiced disdain, watching for any disruption to the carefully curated atmosphere. Last week's incident, when a homeless person had managed to slip in, had gone viral on TikTok. While some commenters had expressed outrage at the staff's handling of the situation, most had laughed. "Keep the riffraff out," was the prevailing sentiment, garnering thousands of likes. In the kitchen, excess food was being disposed of according to policy rendered inedible before being thrown away. "Can't risk encouraging them," the manager always said, though no one specified who they were. The staff knew better than to question this practice, even as they watched perfectly good food destroyed while hungry people lingered just outside. A young socialite adjusted her Cartier watch, complaining about her soup's temperature. "It's barely warm," she protested, pushing it away. "Have them make it again." The bowl, still steaming, would join the waste bin's growing contents. At another table, a hedge fund manager berated a waiter over a wine selection that cost more than the server's monthly rent. Across the street, in the small park that had become an unofficial gathering place for the homeless, a different society operated by different rules. Here a half sandwich was split 6 ways. A single blanket was shared among those who had none. They had their own hierarchy, but it was based on need rather than greed. The youngest and oldest got the warmest spots. The strongest took the outer positions against the wind. Social media had created a new form of cruelty. Videos of pranks played on homeless people regularly went viral, water thrown on their sleeping forms, fake food offerings that turned out to be trash, mockery disguised as charity. The comment sections became battlegrounds between those who saw humanity in suffering and those who saw entertainment. A group of young professionals exited the restaurant, their laughter sharp in the cold air. One of them pulled out his phone to film a sleeping homeless person, planning another viral moment. "Watch this," he snickered, reaching for his water bottle. But his companion grabbed his arm, unexpectedly troubled. "That could be someone's mother," she said softly. The moment passed unfilmed, but the contrast lingered, compassion and cruelty, separated by a choice. Inside Le Bernardin, the evening continued in its practiced elegance. Outside, the temperature continued to drop. 2 worlds existed side by side, separated by glass and gold, by circumstance and choice, by the arbitrary lines society drew between those who mattered and those who didn't. Neither group fully saw the other one looking down or away, the other looking up with a mixture of longing and resentment, but change was coming to both worlds, though none of them knew it yet. In a few hours, a single act of sacrifice would shatter these carefully maintained barriers, forcing both sides to see each other as human for the first time. For now, though, the contrast remained stark: warmth and cold, feast and famine, visibility and invisibility. And somewhere between these 2 worlds, a story of redemption was about to begin, one that would challenge everything both sides believed about worth, wealth, and what it truly means to be human. The glass doors of Le Bernardin felt like a barrier between 2 worlds as Ivy stood before them, her reflection a ghost against the warmth inside. Her stomach had been empty for 2 days now, and desperation had driven her to attempt what she'd promised herself she'd never do again: beg at high-end restaurants. The last time it ended in a viral video that still haunted her social media feeds. Just one more try, she whispered to herself, gathering what remained of her courage. Through the window she could see plates being cleared, food barely touched going to waste. The snow was getting heavier, and she knew the younger kids in her alley would be hungry too. If she could just get some leftovers. The moment she pushed through the door, the atmosphere changed. Conversation stuttered to a halt. Forks paused midway to mouths. The warmth that had seemed so inviting from outside turned suffocating as dozens of eyes turned to stare at the intruder in their midst. "Please," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not asking for fresh food, just what you're throwing away. There are children who haven't eaten in days." A woman in diamonds clutched her purse closer. A man in an expensive suit shifted uncomfortably, suddenly fascinated by his wine glass. But it was the younger diners who proved crueler. Phones emerged from pockets and purses, recording a humiliation with practiced expertise. Lebanon beggar coming in hot. One young man narrated for his Instagram live. "Let's see how this plays out, followers." The maitre d' approached, his face a mask of practiced disdain. "This is unacceptable. Leave immediately, or I'll be forced to call security." Ivy stood her ground, though her legs trembled. "Please, sir, it's snowing outside. There's so much food being thrown away." "Oh my God, is she really trying to lecture us about food waste?" A woman's voice carried across the room, followed by tittering laughter. More phones appeared, more cameras focused on her face. "Security," the maitre d' called, his voice sharp. But before security could arrive, a waiter accidentally bumped into Ivy, sending a tray of water glasses cascading over her. The icy water soaked through her already insufficient clothing, drawing gasps and laughter from the crowd. "How clumsy of me," the waiter said, his mock concern performing perfectly for the cameras. "But then, this isn't really a place for your kind." The humiliation burned hotter than any fever Ivy had endured on the streets. Yet even now she thought of the hungry kids waiting in the alley. "Even the scraps," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please." "Look at me." Everyone, another diner called out in a mocking voice. "I'm poor, so you all have to feel guilty while you eat more laughter, more cameras, more casual cruelty dressed up as entertainment." Security arrived, two large men in black suits. They didn't need to touch her, their presence alone was enough to force her backward toward the door. As she retreated, she heard the comments that would soon accompany viral videos. The audacity. "Don't they have shelters for these people?" Probably just wants money for drugs. Back in the freezing night, Ivy heard the door lock behind her with a decisive click. Through the window, she could see the diners returning to their meals, their moment of entertainment over. Some were already posting their videos, thumbs moving rapidly over phones that cost more than 6 months of her mother's rent had. What they didn't film was what happened next. In the alley behind the restaurant, Ivy found several bags of perfectly good food being thrown into the dumpster. As she salvaged what she could, trying to keep her dignity intact, she heard giggles. Looking up, she saw kitchen staff filming her through a back window. "Dinner," and a show one called out, his voice muffled through the glass. With trembling hands but straight shoulders, Ivy gathered what food she could. She had learned long ago that survival sometimes meant swallowing your pride along with whatever food you could find. The children were waiting, and their hunger mattered more than her humiliation. What she didn't notice, as she turned away from Le Bernardin with her salvaged feast, was the man watching from a corner table, Marcus Sullivan, his untouched dinner growing cold as something long dormant in his conscience began to stir. The following evening, driven by a combination of hunger and a stubborn determination not to let cruelty win, Ivy returned to Le Bernardin. This time, she didn't ask for leftovers or scraps. Instead, she stood silently in a corner, hoping her presence might prick someone's conscience. The snow had turned to sleet, and the promise of hot soup wafting from the kitchen was almost unbearable. A new group of diners had taken up residence at the window tables, their phones already poised. "Hey, isn't that the girl from yesterday's viral video?" one whispered loudly enough to be heard. "The one with 5 million views." Amanda Porter, a waitress known for her efficiency with difficult customers, carried a steaming bowl of French onion soup across the restaurant. The rich aroma made Ivy's stomach clench painfully. Amanda's lips curled into a subtle smirk as she approached, deliberately adjusting her path to pass unnecessarily close to where Ivy stood. What happened next was no accident, though it would be described as one in countless social media posts. Amanda's hip bumped Ivy with calculated precision, sending the scalding soup cascading down the girl's front. The burn was immediate and fierce, but it was the deliberate nature of the act that hurt more than the heat. "Oh dear," Amanda's voice dripped with false concern, playing to her audience. "Look what you made me do. That soup costs more than you're worth, you know." The restaurant erupted in poorly concealed laughter. Phones captured every moment of Ivy's pain, every wince as the hot liquid soaked through her thin clothes. Someone started a slow clap. But then something unexpected happened. Tommy, the one-legged boy from Ivy's alley, had been watching through the window. He pushed through the door on his crutches, his own clothes hardly better than Ivy's, but his voice strong with righteous anger. "I saw what you did," he challenged Amanda. "You did that on purpose." A young girl, no more than 7, tugged at her mother's sleeve at a nearby table. "Mummy, why are they being so mean?" The soup lady pushed her on purpose. "Quiet, sweetie," the mother hushed, uncomfortable with her daughter's unvarnished truth. But others were coming now, the street children Ivy had helped, the elderly homeless she'd shared food with. They pressed their faces against the windows, their presence an accusation that even the most hardened diners found difficult to ignore. Marcus Sullivan, dining alone again, watched the scene unfold. He saw how Ivy, despite the pain and humiliation, reached out to steady Tommy when he stumbled. He noticed how she positioned herself between Amanda and the younger children, protective even in her vulnerability. "This is outrageous," the maitre d' blustered, reaching for his phone to call security. "We'll have the whole homeless population of Manhattan in here next." Amanda, sensing her moment of cruel triumph slipping, doubled down. "Look at all your little friends," she sneered at Ivy. "Shall I order soup for everyone? Oh wait, you people prefer diving through our dumpsters, don't you?" But Ivy straightened up, soup still dripping from her clothes, and met Amanda's gaze with quiet dignity. "At least in the dumpster," she said softly, "we share what we find." "Can you say the same about your life, ma'am?" The response silenced the restaurant. Even the most enthusiastic phone filmers lowered their devices, somehow sensing that they'd witnessed something that shouldn't be reduced to a viral moment. Sullivan set down his fork, his food untasted. He watched as Ivy gathered her dignity around her like a cloak and turned to leave, not in defeat, but with a grace that made everyone else in the room look small. "Come on," she said to Tommy and the others. "We still have half a loaf of bread back at the alley. That's better than soup served with cruelty." As they left, the young girl who had spoken earlier broke free from her mother's grip. Running to Ivy, she pressed her own untouched bread roll into the girl's hand. "I'm sorry they're mean," she whispered. Ivy's smile, captured by a dozen cameras but understood by few, was radiant with forgiveness. "Thank you, little one," she said. "Remember this moment when you grow up." Outside in the sleet, Ivy broke the bread roll into pieces, sharing it among her small family of outcasts. The warmth of their solidarity meant more than any soup could have. Inside, Sullivan pushed away his plate, his appetite gone. In his mind, his sister Claire's voice echoed the measure of a society is not in how it treats its highest achievers, but in how it treats its most vulnerable. The sleet had turned back to snow as Ivy and her small group made their way across the street to their usual gathering place near Central Park. The bread roll, though small, had been carefully divided into 8 pieces, one each for the youngest children, with Ivy herself taking only the smallest crumb. Through the swirling snow, she noticed an elderly woman struggling outside the nearby pharmacy. Even from a distance, Ivy could see the woman's hands trembling as she counted coins over and over, her breath forming desperate clouds in the frigid air. The pharmacist's voice carried clearly through the glass, "No partial payments. Either you have enough for the full prescription, or you don't." Ivy felt the weight of the few coins in her pocket, donations from rare, kind passers-by, saved carefully over weeks. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy a real meal, something she'd been dreaming of for days. She looked at the coins, then at the elderly woman's face creased with worry, and made her decision. Meanwhile, Marcus Sullivan was leaving Le Bernardin, his phone pressed to his ear as he argued with Richard's lawyers. "No, I won't sign away my right to modify the will. This is still my money, my choice." He was distracted, troubled by what he'd witnessed in the restaurant, his sister's voice still echoing in his mind. Ivy approached the pharmacy counter, sliding her precious coins across to join the elderly woman's pile. The woman turned, startled by this unexpected intervention from a street child. "Oh no, dear, I couldn't possibly," the woman began, but Ivy cut her off gently. "My mother always said medicine is more important than food," she said softly. "Please take it." The pharmacist looked uncomfortable now, faced with this display of generosity from someone who clearly had nothing to spare. He quickly counted the combined money and handed over the prescription, unable to meet either of their eyes. The elderly woman gripped Ivy's hand, her own warm despite the cold. "What's your name, child?" "Ivy," she replied, managing a small smile, "like the plant that grows even in winter." "You're an angel, Ivy, a true angel in this cold city." As the woman left with her medicine, Ivy felt a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Her mother had taught her that kindness was a currency that never ran out, even when your pockets were empty. Sullivan, still on his phone, had paused to witness this exchange. He was about to step forward, moved by what he'd seen, when his phone distracted him with another urgent message about hospital policies. Looking down at the screen, he stepped into the street. He didn't hear the bus at first. The snow muffled everything, creating an illusion of safety in the white silence. But Ivy saw the bus sliding on the ice, saw Sullivan absorbed in his phone, saw the trajectory that would end in tragedy. But time seemed to slow. In that moment, Ivy thought of many things: the cruel laughter in the restaurant, the phones filming her humiliation, the system that had let her mother die. This man in his expensive coat probably had never known real hunger or cold. He might even have been one of those who turned away the sick and poor from hospitals like her mother. But her mother's voice came to her, clear as a bell: "Our choices make us who we are, not our circumstances." Without hesitation, Ivy sprinted towards Sullivan. The bus horn blared, finally catching his attention, but too late. He was frozen in shock, the phone dropping from his hand. Ivy's small body hit him with surprising force, pushing him clear of the bus's path. The impact, when it came, was both softer and harder than she'd expected. She felt herself flying, then falling, then nothing at all. Sullivan, sprawled on the snowy sidewalk, looked up in horror as the bus screeched to a halt. The gathered crowd gasped collectively, phones now filming a different kind of tragedy. Through the swirling snow, he could see a small, crumpled form lying still on the street. The same elderly woman from the pharmacy rushed forward, recognizing Ivy. "The angel," she cried out. She just saved that man's life. Sullivan scrambled to his feet, rushing to Ivy's side. Blood was seeping into the snow, turning it a pale pink. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, focusing on him with unexpected clarity. "Are you okay, sir?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. In that moment, Looking into the eyes of the child who had just saved his life, the same child he had watched being humiliated and scorned, Sullivan felt something break inside him. This girl, who had every reason to let him die, had chosen to save him instead. As sirens wailed in the distance and the crowd pressed closer, Sullivan cradled Ivy's small form, his expensive coat now stained with her blood. Neither of them knew it yet, but this moment would change not just their lives but the very fabric of their city's soul. In these moments that touch our hearts, your support means everything. If our story has moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Every subscription helps us continue sharing these meaningful narratives that remind us of our shared humanity and the power of compassion. Together, we can spread more stories that matter. The aftermath of the impact unfolded like a scene in slow motion. Snow continued to fall silently, indifferent to the drama below, as a crowd gathered around the small figure lying motionless on the street. The bus driver had emerged, his face ashen, repeating over and over, "She came out of nowhere, just trying to save him." Sullivan knelt in the blood-stained snow, his expensive cashmere coat wrapped around Ivy's tiny frame. Her breathing was shallow, each exhale creating small clouds in the freezing air. The same phones that had moments ago captured her humiliation now recorded her sacrifice, but the tone of the whispers had changed dramatically. "That's the girl from Le Bernardin. She saved him after everything. Did you see how she didn't even hesitate?" The elderly woman Ivy had helped at the pharmacy pushed through the crowd, clutching her prescription bag. "She gave her last coins to help me," she announced, her voice breaking. "And now this. She's an angel, a real angel." Sullivan cradled Ivy's head, overwhelmed by the gravity of what had just happened. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, focusing on his face with surprising clarity. "Your phone," she whispered. "Did you save your phone?" The absurdity of her concern for his $1,000 device while she lay bleeding struck him like a physical blow. "Don't worry about the phone," he managed, his voice thick. "Just stay with me. Help is coming." But Ivy's next words froze him to his core. "The children. In the alley. Someone needs to check on them. They're waiting for me to bring food." Even now, bleeding on the cold pavement, her thoughts were for others. Sullivan felt something crack inside his carefully constructed world of profit margins and bottom lines. This child, whom society had discarded, possessed a wealth he had somehow lost along the way. The sirens grew closer, their wail cutting through the winter night. Tommy, the one-legged boy from earlier, had hobbled to the scene on his crutches. "Ivy," he called out, his young voice raw with fear. "You can't leave us? Who's going to tell us stories at night? Who's going to make sure the little ones eat first?" Sullivan looked up at the gathered crowd, really seeing them for the first time: the homeless children, the elderly poor, all the invisible people his world had trained him to look past. They weren't just watching, they were praying, crying, reaching out with the compassion he had forgotten existed. The paramedics arrived, their practiced efficiency cutting through the chaos. As they worked to stabilize Ivy, one of them looked up at Sullivan. "She needs immediate surgery. We'll take her to Metropolitan." "No," Sullivan said, his voice finding strength. "Take her to Sullivan Memorial." He saw the paramedics' hesitation. Sullivan Memorial was his hospital, known for its strict policies against treating the uninsured. "I'm Marcus Sullivan. This child is under my personal care now." The words felt right as soon as he said them, as if he had been waiting his whole life to make this declaration. The crowd murmured, recognizing his name, understanding the significance of what was happening. As they loaded Ivy into the ambulance, her small hand caught Sullivan's sleeve. "Promise," she whispered, "promise you'll check on the children." "I promise," he replied, and in that moment he made another silent promise to himself that this would be the beginning of real change. The ambulance doors closed, and Sullivan watched it pull away, its lights reflecting off the falling snow. His phone lay forgotten in a slush puddle, messages from Richard's lawyers still flashing unread on the cracked screen. None of that seemed to matter anymore. Tommy approached him, balancing on his crutches. "Mister," he said, his voice small but determined, "Ivy always says that promises are sacred. She never breaks them, even when it hurts." Sullivan looked down at the boy, seeing him for the first time. "Tell me about these children she cares for," he said quietly. "Tell me everything." As they talked, the snow continued to fall, covering the bloodstains on the ground, erasing the physical evidence of what had happened here. But nothing could erase the change that had begun in Sullivan's heart, a change that would soon reshape not just his life, but the lives of countless others. The emergency room at Sullivan Memorial Hospital hummed with controlled chaos as doctors rushed to assess Ivy's condition. The irony wasn't lost on Sullivan. This was the same hospital that had turned away countless others like her, the same pristine halls where profit had always trumped compassion. Multiple internal injuries, the lead physician announced, studying the scans. Severe kidney damage from the impact. She needs immediate surgery, but he hesitated, glancing uncertainly at Sullivan. But what Sullivan demanded? "Sir, given her condition and background, perhaps Metropolitan would be more appropriate. Their charitable care program." "This is my hospital," Sullivan cut him off, his voice sharp. "And she is my responsibility. Give her the best care we have." As the medical team prepped for surgery, a young nurse approached Sullivan with a tablet. "Sir, I need to access her records for the surgery consent forms." Her fingers flew over the screen, then stopped abruptly. Her face paled. "What is it?" Sullivan asked, noting her changed expression. "Sir, according to our records, an Ivy Martinez was here last winter. With her mother, Sarah Martinez, the nurse swallowed hard. They were turned away due to lack of insurance. The mother died of pneumonia complications at County General the next day." The world seemed to tilt beneath Sullivan's feet. He grabbed the tablet, scanning the records himself. There it was, his own policy in action. A policy that had killed this child's mother, created another orphan, another invisible person for society to step around. "The same girl," he whispered, though he already knew the answer. "The same girl who just saved my life." A commotion at the emergency room entrance interrupted his revelation. Richard, his adopted son, burst in, followed by his lawyers. "Father, what's this I hear about you admitting a homeless patient? The board is in an uproar." Sullivan stared at his son, seeing him with new eyes. Richard, in his perfectly tailored suit, radiating entitlement and disdain, represented everything he had become, everything Claire had warned him against. "Her mother died because of me," Sullivan said quietly, his voice heavy with realization. "Because of rules I made, and today she saved my life without hesitation." "Father, you're in shock. You can't let one emotional incident override years of sound business practice. Think of the precedent this sets." But Sullivan wasn't listening. The doctor had returned with more news, each word hammering another nail into the coffin of his old world view. "Mr. Sullivan, the impact severely damaged both her kidneys. She needs a transplant immediately, or she won't survive the night." Richard scoffed. "Surely you're not suggesting—" "Test me," Sullivan interrupted. "Test me for compatibility." The doctor shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, given your position, perhaps we should explore other options." "Test me now," Sullivan insisted. "And while you're doing that, I want every record pulled of patients we've turned away in the past year. Every single one." Richard stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "Father, as your legal counsel, I strongly advise against this. The liability alone." Enough, Sullivan's voice cracked like thunder through the emergency room. "I've spent years hiding behind policies and procedures, pretending that business justifies inhumanity. No more." The doctor cleared his throat. "Sir, there's something else you should know. We ran preliminary tests. The girl, Ivy, her blood type and initial markers suggest she might be related to you." The world stopped for a moment. Sullivan remembered Claire again, her last words about having something important to tell him. The accident that silenced her forever. Could it be? Run every test he ordered, and get me Claire's old medical records, everything. As the medical team rushed to comply, Sullivan walked to the window overlooking the city. Snow was still falling, covering everything in a blank white canvas. Below, he could see more of Ivy's street family gathering, their faces turned up toward the hospital lights with hope and fear. He pressed his hand against the cold glass, remembering Ivy's last conscious words, not about herself, but about the children who needed her. In trying to save him, had she orphaned them all over again? No, he whispered to his reflection. Not this time. This time we make it right. Behind him, Richard was already on the phone with the board members, trying to contain what he saw as a PR disaster. But Sullivan had stopped listening to those voices. Instead, he heard Claire's voice, clearer than ever sometimes. Marcus, redemption comes in the most unexpected ways. The hospital laboratory hummed with urgent activity as technicians rushed the compatibility tests. Sullivan sat in the consultation room, the weight of multiple revelations pressing down on him. Before him lay 3 documents that would change everything: Ivy's current medical status, his own test results, and a yellowed envelope from Claire's personal effects marked for Marcus. When you're ready to listen. Dr. Chen, the hospital's chief of surgery, entered with a grave expression. Mr. Sullivan, we have the results. He paused, choosing his words carefully. You're a match for the kidney donation. However, what Sullivan pressed. Your recent cardiac screening shows significant heart disease. The stress of major surgery could trigger a fatal cardiac event. In simple terms, donating your kidney could kill you. Richard burst through the door, waving legal documents. The board has convened an emergency session. They're threatening to remove you if you go through with this. Everything you've built could be lost. Sullivan looked down at Claire's envelope, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside was a photograph he'd never seen before: Claire, heavily pregnant, with a letter dated just days before her death. Dear Marcus, it began, by the time you read this, you'll either have changed or you'll have lost everything that truly matters. The baby I'm carrying is the reason I was coming to see you that night. I wanted my child to have an uncle who remembered our parents' values, not just their business acumen. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Claire's accident, the baby presumed lost, the hospital records showing a young mother named Sarah Martinez adopting an infant around the same time. She's Claire's daughter, Sullivan whispered. Ivy is my niece. The revelation hung in the air like suspended snow. Richard's face contorted with rage. All the more reason to protect your interests. Think of the scandal. The homeless girl you've been ignoring is actually a Sullivan. Dr. Chen cleared his throat. Mr. Sullivan, we need your decision. The girl's condition is deteriorating. Without the transplant, she has perhaps hours. With it, you might not survive. And there are no other compatible donors available in time. Sullivan stood, walking to the window. Below, he could see Tommy and the other street children, still maintaining their vigil in the snow. They had formed a small circle, sharing a single blanket, watching the hospital lights like stars they could wish upon. He thought of Ivy sharing her last coins, of her pushing him out of the bus's path without hesitation, of her asking about his phone while she lay bleeding. He thought of Claire, her last act being an attempt to remind him of their shared humanity. Richard, he said quietly, you've always wanted control of the hospital network. Now you can have it with one condition. His son's eyes narrowed suspiciously. What condition? Transform it. Open free clinics. Change the admission policies. Make it what Claire always dreamed it could be. You're delirious, Richard scoffed. That would destroy decades of profit optimization. Sullivan turned from the window, his face set with determination. Then I'll sell everything. Every share, every property. I'll set up a foundation with the proceeds before I go into surgery. Either way, this ends tonight." "You could die," Dr. Chen reminded him softly. "Yes," Sullivan agreed, "but for the first time in decades, I'll die doing something that matters." He picked up the consent forms, signing them with a steady hand. "Prep for surgery, and send someone to bring those children in from the cold. They're family too now." Richard stormed out, already calling his lawyers, but Sullivan barely noticed. He was reading the end of Claire's letter. ... Remember when we were children, Marcus? You once gave me your last cookie, saying sisters matter more than snacks. That's the brother I'm hoping will read this someday. The one who remembers that people matter more than profits. Love, Claire. Sullivan folded the letter carefully, placing it in his pocket next to his heart. "I remember now, Claire," he whispered. "I finally remember." Dr. Chen touched his arm gently. "The surgical team is ready. Are you sure about this?" Sullivan looked out one last time at the falling snow, at the city he'd helped shape for better or worse. "You know what's strange, Doctor? I've never been more sure of anything in my life." As they wheeled him toward the operating room, he could hear the sounds of children being welcomed into the hospital's warm lobby, their voices carrying a hope he hadn't heard in years. "Tell Ivy," he said to Dr. Chen, "tell her I kept my promise. Tell her the children will be cared for, no matter what happens to me." The anesthesia began to take hold, and Sullivan felt a peace he hadn't known since childhood. His last conscious thought was of Ivy's smile as she shared her meager bread with others, teaching him again what real wealth looked like. The surgical floor of Sullivan Memorial hummed with an energy unlike anything its staff had ever experienced. 2 operating rooms were being prepped simultaneously, one for Ivy, one for Sullivan. The usual strict hierarchy of the hospital had dissolved in the face of this unprecedented situation, the CEO himself preparing to risk death to save a homeless girl who turned out to be his niece. In pre-op, Sullivan sat upright in his bed, using these final moments to ensure his promises would be kept. His personal lawyer, Sarah Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, took rapid notes as he dictated his new will. "Make it ironclad," he insisted. 50% of my wealth goes to establishing the Claire Martinez Memorial Foundation, focusing on healthcare for homeless children. The remaining 50% goes into a trust for Ivy, with the condition that she uses part of it to maintain and expand the foundation's work." "And Richard?" Sarah asked quietly. "He retains his position only if he implements the new policies we've outlined. If he refuses, the board has instructions to replace him." Sullivan's voice was firm, even as nurses began attaching monitoring equipment to his chest. In the adjacent pre-op room, Ivy drifted in and out of consciousness. The street children had been brought in from the cold, given warm clothes and food, and now took turns sitting with her. Tommy hadn't left her side, his crutches propped against her bed. "You can't leave us, Ivy," he whispered, holding her thin hand. "Who's going to remind us that being poor doesn't mean being worthless?" A nurse passing by wiped tears from her eyes, remembering how many times she'd had to turn away people just like these children, following policies she'd hated but felt powerless to change. Dr. Chen entered Sullivan's room for the final pre-surgery consultation. "Mr. Sullivan, I need to be clear one last time about the risks. Your heart condition means there's only about a 30% chance you'll survive the surgery. Are you certain you want to proceed?" Sullivan looked past him to where Ivy lay in the next room, surrounded by her makeshift family. "What are her chances without the transplant?" "0, Dr. Chen replied softly. "Then there's nothing to discuss." Sullivan reached for the pen again, beginning to write a letter. "Could you make sure she gets this, if things don't go well?" The doctor nodded, watching as Sullivan's hands trembled slightly, but continued writing. "Dear Ivy, if you're reading this, the surgery didn't go as we hoped, at least for me. Don't feel guilty. This was my choice. and the most meaningful one I've ever made. You saved more than my life today. You saved my soul. Your mother, my sister Claire, would have been so proud of the woman you've become. She always believed in putting people before profits, in measuring wealth by how much you give rather than how much you have. I've arranged everything for you and your street family. The hospital will never turn away another person in need. The foundation in your mother's name will ensure that. But more importantly, I want you to know that you were right. Promises are sacred. I promise you this, your act of kindness will create ripples of change long after I'm gone. Every child you've cared for will be provided for. Every lesson you've taught about sharing, about dignity, about true wealth they'll live on. You showed me what real richness looks like. It's not in bank accounts or boardrooms. It's in sharing your last coins with a stranger. It's in protecting those weaker than yourself. It's in forgiveness, even when the world has given you every reason to be bitter. Take care of them, Ivy. Take care of yourself. And remember, you were never invisible. You were just waiting for the rest of us to learn how to see. With love and gratitude, your Uncle Marcus. As nurses began wheeling him towards surgery, Sullivan caught Dr. Chen's arm. One more thing, he said. If it comes down to a choice between saving her or harvesting the kidney, save her. Clear. Clear. The doctor squeezed his arm in understanding. Outside the window, the snow had finally stopped, leaving the city blanketed in white, a clean slate, a new beginning. In the other pre-op room, Ivy stirred briefly. Tell him, she whispered to Tommy, tell him I understand now. Sometimes the richest people are the ones who have nothing left to give but give anyway. The surgical teams began their final preparations. In the waiting room, Richard sat alone, his face a mask of conflicting emotions as he read through the new hospital policies. The street children huddled together, sharing stories about Ivy, their quiet prayers mixing with the hospital's mechanical hums. Dr. Chen looked between the two operating rooms, knowing that whatever happened next would change not just these lives, but the very soul of the hospital itself. He thought of all the patients they'd turned away over the years, of all the invisible people who might have been saved. Ready, he asked his teams. They nodded, understanding that they were part of something larger than a surgery. They were part of a redemption story, a transformation. A moment when the world's cruel mathematics of worth and worthlessness was being rewritten by love. The operating room doors closed simultaneously, and the real work began. The news of Sullivan's decision spread through the city's elite circles like wildfire. As the surgery proceeded, the hospital's main conference room had become a battlefield. Richard Sullivan stood at the head of the table, surrounded by board members, major shareholders, and family representatives from the extended Sullivan clan. "This is madness," thundered Harold Sullivan, Marcus's elderly cousin and longtime board member. "He's throwing away generations of business acumen for some street urchin, illegitimate or not." Richard paced the room, his designer shoes clicking against the marble floor. Newspapers and tablets displayed headlines: Sullivan Memorial CEO's secret niece, a homeless hero hospital empire, at risk, Sullivan's last-minute change of heart. "The stock is already dropping," announced Patricia Whitmore, the chief financial officer. "Our shareholders are panicking. This kind of radical policy change, treating the uninsured, opening free clinics, it's financial suicide." Outside the conference room windows, news vans had begun to gather. The story was too sensational to ignore: a wealthy CEO sacrificing himself for a homeless girl, the discovery of a lost heir, the transformation of a healthcare empire. "We need to act now," Richard declared, spreading legal documents across the table. "As his son, I can petition for temporary control, citing his mental instability." "That won't work," interrupted Sarah Chen, Sullivan's lawyer, entering the room with quiet authority. "Your father's mental acuity was thoroughly documented before surgery. And there's more." She placed a sealed envelope on the table. "DNA results confirming Ivy's relationship to the Sullivan family. She's not just any lost heir, she's Claire Sullivan's daughter. The room erupted in chaos. Claire had been the family's conscience, the one who'd fought against their profit-first mentality. Her death had marked the beginning of Sullivan Memorial's most aggressive profit-focused era. "This changes nothing," Richard slammed his fist on the table. "She's still a street rat, raised in gutters. You can't expect her to." To what came a new voice. Tommy stood in the doorway, supported by his crutches, his young face fierce with determination. Behind him, a group of street children filled the corridor, their presence a stark contrast to the room's opulent decor. "To understand wealth," Tommy continued, his voice carrying surprising strength. "Ivy taught us that real wealth isn't in bank accounts. It's in how many people you help, how much love you share." Patricia scoffed. "How precious. And I suppose love pays the hospital's operating costs." Actually, Sarah Chen interjected. "Pulling up financial projections, preliminary analysis shows that with the tax benefits of converting to a hybrid non-profit model, combined with the positive publicity and increased donor support." But she was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. More people were arriving, former patients who'd been turned away, families who'd lost loved ones to the hospital's strict policies. They'd heard about Sullivan's transformation and had come to share their stories. "My mother died in your parking lot," one woman called out. "You wouldn't admit her without insurance." "My son couldn't get his medication," added another. "Now he's disabled permanently." The stories kept coming, a tide of testimony that even the board members couldn't ignore. Richard's face grew increasingly pale as he recognized how their policies had affected real people. "Listen to yourselves," Tommy spoke again, his voice cutting through the chaos. "While you're arguing about money, two people are fighting for their lives in surgery. One of them is your father." He looked directly at Richard, who finally understood what his sister knew all along, that a hospital shouldn't be a business first and a healing place second. Sarah Chen stepped forward, laying out more documents. "Mr. Sullivan's new directives aren't just ethical, they're revolutionary. The Claire Martinez Memorial Foundation will actually expand our reach, bringing in federal grants and private donations. Yes, profits might decrease initially, but our impact will grow exponentially." "And what about shareholders?" demanded Harold. "They'll have a choice," Sarah replied. "Stay with us and be part of something revolutionary, or sell their shares, which the foundation is prepared to purchase at a premium." Richard sank into a chair, finally seeing the full scope of his father's vision. It wasn't just about saving one girl, it was about saving the hospital's soul, about returning to the principles his Aunt Claire had died trying to protect. A nurse burst into the room, her face urgent. "They need the board's immediate approval for additional procedures. Both patients are critical." Richard stood slowly, looking around at the faces in the room, the wealthy board members, the street children, the affected families. He thought of his father, who'd rather die doing the right thing than live with the wrong ones. "Move everything," he said quietly. "Whatever they need." And he took a deep breath. "Start implementing the new policies. All of them. Now." Tommy smiled, tears in his eyes. "Ivy always said everyone is good in them, if you give them a chance to find it." As the board members filed out, transformed by the stories they'd heard, Richard approached Tommy. "Tell me about her," he said softly. "Tell me about my cousin." Outside, the crowd of supporters had grown. News cameras captured the moment as Richard emerged to announce the hospital's transformation. But the real story was happening in the operating rooms above, where two lives hung in the balance, their sacrifice already changing the world around them. As the surgeries continued, Sarah Chen found herself in the hospital's records room, piecing together a story that had been buried for 13 years. Spread before her on a dusty desk were photographs, medical records, and Claire Sullivan's personal diary, each item revealing another layer of a tragedy that had shaped countless lives. A photograph from 2010 showed Claire and Sarah Martinez together at a free clinic Claire had secretly funded. They weren't just patient and benefactor, they were friends. Claire's diary entry from that day reads, Sarah understands what Marcus has forgotten, that healing isn't a privilege, it's a right. She's agreed to help me protect the baby, no matter what happens. The truth emerged like a photograph developing in darkroom chemicals. Claire, unmarried and pregnant, had known her brother would never accept her child under the circumstances. Sarah Martinez, a kind-hearted nurse who shared Claire's values, had agreed to adopt the baby if anything happened to Claire. The accident wasn't entirely an accident, Sarah Chen murmured, reading police reports with new eyes. Claire's car had been forced off the road by an unmarked vehicle. She'd survived long enough to give birth, but died shortly after, leaving explicit instructions with Sarah Martinez about protecting the child. In a locked drawer, Chen found letters that Claire had written to her unborn daughter. My dearest Ivy, I named you after the plant that grows even through concrete, that finds life where others see only walls. Your Uncle Marcus wasn't always the man he is now. Once he was the kindest brother imaginable. Money changed him, but I believe love can change him back. Someday, if you're reading this, know that every choice I made was to protect you. The world of wealth and privilege I grew up in has a way of poisoning souls. I wanted you to learn compassion before comfort, love before luxury. Sarah will raise you with the values I believe in. Maybe someday you'll help Marcus remember them too. Love your mother. As Chen read, a nurse brought in another file, Sarah Martinez's death certificate from last winter. The cause of death, pneumonia, after being turned away from Sullivan Memorial Hospital, the same hospital her friend Claire had once hoped would serve all people equally. The irony was almost too painful to comprehend. Claire's daughter had ended up homeless because of policies her own uncle had implemented. Yet somehow through all of it, Ivy had grown into exactly the person her mother had hoped she'd be, someone who understood that true wealth lay in compassion. A series of security cameras still showed Ivy growing up a small girl sharing her lunch with classmates who couldn't afford food, a teenager defending younger kids from bullies, a young woman creating a family among the forgotten children of the streets. Without knowing it, she'd inherited her mother's spirit entirely. Chen found one final letter, dated the day of Claire's accident. Dear Marcus, by the time you read this, you'll either have changed back into the brother I love, or you'll have lost something far more precious than money. My daughter carries our parents' true legacy, not their business acumen, but their belief that every life has equal worth. I've arranged things so she'll learn this truth from the ground up, not from the top down. Privilege blinds us, brother. Sometimes we need to lose everything to see what really matters. Take care of her, if you ever find her. She'll have so much to teach you. Love always. Claire. As Chen organized these documents, her phone buzzed with updates from the operating rooms. Both surgeries were at critical stages. Sullivan's heart was struggling, while Ivy's body was showing signs of rejecting the transplant. Yet they fought on, uncle and niece, connected by more than just blood and surgery. The final piece of the puzzle was a photograph Chen almost missed. It had slipped behind a filing cabinet, a picture of young Marcus and Claire as children, sharing a cookie in the snow. On the back, in Claire's handwriting, remember who you were, Marcus. Remember that sharing makes us richer, not poorer. Chen gathered everything into a folder just as Richard entered the records room. His face showed the strain of the past hours. Did you find what you were looking for? He asked quietly. She handed him Claire's last letter. As he read, his composed facade cracked. All this time, he whispered, we were the poor ones, weren't we? Poor in all the ways that really matter. Through the window, they could see the crowd of supporters growing larger. The street children had begun sharing their food with the gathered reporters and photographers, showing the world what Ivy had taught them about true wealth. Your cousin Chen said gently to Richard, she's exactly what this hospital needs, what this family needs, if they survive. When Richard corrected her, when they survive, he straightened his shoulders, looking more like his father than ever before. We have a lot of changes to make, don't we? Chen smiled, gathering the precious documents. These would become part of the hospital's new mission statement, a reminder of how loss and love had transformed a palace of privilege into a haven of healing. Above them, in 2 operating rooms, life and death continued their ancient dance. But now the whole story was clear how a mother's love, a sister's wisdom, and a child's compassion had set in motion events that would heal not just bodies, but the very soul of a broken system. The operating rooms at Sullivan Memorial had never been so quiet, yet so charged with intensity. In O1, Dr. Chen led the team working on Ivy, while in O2, Dr. Sarah Reynolds, the hospital's top cardiac surgeon, fought to keep Sullivan stable during the kidney retrieval. The clock on the wall showed 2:47 a.m. In O1, monitors beeped steadily as Dr. Chen carefully prepared for the transplant. Her pressures dropping, a nurse announced, temperature at 96.1 and falling. Dr. Chen's voice remained steady, though his hands betrayed the slightest tremor. Push another unit of warm saline. We need to keep her stable until we have that kidney. In O2, things were becoming critical. Sullivan's heart monitor showed increasingly erratic patterns, each spike and dip telling the story of a heart struggling against the strain. V-Touch Dr. Reynolds called out, "We're losing him." The monitor's alarm pierced the sterile silence. Sullivan's heart was failing, just as they'd feared, but they hadn't even retrieved the kidney yet. "Push 1 amp of epinephrine," Dr. Reynolds ordered, "and someone get me an update from O1. We need to know if we should continue." The operating rooms were connected by an intercom system normally used for routine communications. Tonight, it carried the weight of impossible choices between 2 teams fighting to save 2 lives. Or 1, 2, or 2, Dr. Chen's voice crackled through. "Ivy's failing. Without that kidney in the next 20 minutes, we'll lose her." Dr. Reynolds looked at Sullivan's monitors, then at her team. "If we continue, we'll likely lose him. If we stop, then we lose them," both her assistant finished quietly. The clock ticked to 2:52 a.m. In the observation room above, Richard watched with Tommy beside him, both holding their breath at each monitor spike. "Come on, Dad," Richard whispered. "Fight!" In O2, Sullivan's heart suddenly stabilized, as if responding to his son's plea. Dr. Reynolds seized the moment. "We proceed," she announced. "Full speed, perfect precision. This is our window." Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, years of training condensed into these crucial minutes. The kidney retrieval was delicate work under the best circumstances. Under these conditions, it was like performing a ballet on a tightrope. In O1, Ivy's condition continued to deteriorate. BP 80 over 40 and falling, the nurse reported. "She's going into shock." Dr. Chen looked at the clock, 2:58 a.m. "Come on, Marcus," he muttered. "Give us time." The intercom crackled again. "Or 2 or 1. We have the kidney. Sullivan's critical but holding. Beginning transfer now." A specialized transfer team moved with choreographed precision, rushing the harvested kidney from one operating room to the other. Years of training had prepared them for this moment, but never with stakes so high. As they worked to transplant the kidney, Ivy's monitor suddenly flatlined. "Code blue," Dr. Chen shouted. "Beginning chest compressions." The room erupted into controlled chaos. One nurse counted compressions while another prepared the defibrillator. The precious kidney sat in its preservation solution, waiting. Clear the first shock sent Ivy's small body arching off the table. Nothing. Again. Clear. The monitor remained stubbornly flat. In or two, Sullivan's heart monitor began its own alarm. "We're losing him too," Dr. Reynolds called out. "Beginning resuscitation." For a moment, both operating rooms were mirrors of each other, two teams performing CPR, two bodies refusing to give up, two lives hanging by increasingly fraying threads. The clock read 3:03 a.m. In or one, Dr. Chen tried one more time. Clear. A beat. Then another. Weak but present. "We have rhythm. Moving forward with transplant." The next 45 minutes passed in intense concentration as Dr. Chen worked to connect the kidney. Every suture had to be perfect, every connection precise. Meanwhile, in or two, Dr. Reynolds fought her own battle. Sullivan's heart had stabilized but remained dangerously weak. The loss of blood during the kidney retrieval had strained his already compromised system to its limits. "BP's dropping again," her nurse warned. "Not yet, Mr. Sullivan," Dr. Reynolds muttered as she worked. "Your niece needs you to hold on just a little longer." The clock ticked to 4 a.m. In the observation room, Richard and Tommy had been joined by more of the street children, all pressed against the glass, their breath fogging the window as they watched the teams work to save their protector and her uncle. Finally, at 4:17 a.m., Dr. Chen stepped back from the table. "Kidney is in place and showing early signs of function," he announced. "Now we wait." In or two, Dr. Reynolds was closing Sullivan's incision when his heart monitor suddenly showed strong, regular beats. "Well, I'll be damned," she whispered. "Look at that rhythm. It's like his heart knew the job was done." The intercom crackled one final time that night, or 1202. "Ivy's new kidney is pink and perfusing. She's going to make it." In the observation room, Richard slid down the wall, tears streaming down his face. Tommy hugged the nearest child, then the next, until all of Ivy's street family was embracing, crying, laughing. Dawn was breaking over Manhattan as the surgical teams finally emerged, exhausted but triumphant. Against all odds, both patients were alive. Now came the waiting to see if survival could become recovery, if second chances could become new beginnings. The first 24 hours after transplant surgery are crucial, and the intensive care unit at Sullivan Memorial became the epicenter of a vigil that transcended social boundaries. Two adjacent rooms hosted Sullivan and Ivy, their lives still hanging precariously in the balance. 5:30 a.m., 6 hours post-surgery. In Ivy's room, the monitors showed concerning patterns. Her body, weakened by years of malnutrition and exposure, was struggling to accept the new kidney. Dr. Chen stood by her bed, studying the readings with growing concern. Temperatures rising, a nurse reported, 102.3 and climbing. "Early rejection signs," Dr. Chen muttered. "Start the anti-rejection protocol. Maximum safe dose." In the next room, Sullivan's condition was equally precarious. His heart rhythm, initially stable after surgery, had become increasingly erratic. Dr. Reynolds hadn't left his side, watching each beat as if through sheer will she could keep his heart pumping. "Blood pressure's dropping again," her assistant warned. 73/45. 9:45 a.m., 10 hours post-surgery. The hospital chapel had filled with an unlikely congregation. Richard sat in the front pew, his designer suit wrinkled from hours of waiting. Behind him, Tommy led the street children in whispered prayers they'd learned from Ivy. Nurses and doctors stopped by between shifts, adding their own quiet hopes to the collective vigil. The crisis struck without warning. Ivy's monitors screamed to life as her body began actively rejecting the kidney. Dr. Chen rushed in, barking orders. "Full immune suppression. We're losing the graft." Through the ICU window, Tommy watched in horror as Ivy's small body convulsed. The other children pressed against the glass, their faces reflecting the harsh hospital lights. "Remember what Ivy always says," Tommy whispered to them. "Hope is strongest in the dark." 11:23 a.m., 12 hours post-surgery. Sullivan's heart stopped. The code team descended with practiced efficiency, but there was nothing routine about this resuscitation. Dr. Reynolds counted the seconds as they performed CPR. "Come on, Marcus," she muttered between compressions. "You didn't come this far to give up now." In the chapel, Richard felt a strange calm descend. He remembered his father's words from years ago sometime: "Son, wealth isn't what you keep. It's what you're willing to give away." 2:15 p.m., 15 hours post-surgery. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the street children, a quiet girl named Maria, tugged at Dr. Chen's sleeve. "Ivy always holds our hands when we're scared," she said softly. Maybe she needs someone to hold hers." Dr. Chen, having exhausted medical options, nodded. Maria, properly scrubbed and gowned, entered Ivy's room. She took her friend's hand and began singing the lullaby Ivy used to comfort the younger children. Remarkably, Ivy's vitals began to stabilize. "It's working," the nurse whispered. "Her numbers are improving." 4:47 p.m., 17 hours post-surgery. Sullivan's crisis peaked. His heart, struggling against the strain of surgery and years of stress, seemed determined to give out. Dr. Reynolds had tried everything in the medical playbook. Then Richard made a decision. Against all protocols, he entered his father's room and leaned close to his ear. "Dad, Ivy's fighting. She needs her uncle. The hospital needs its soul. I need my father. Please." The monitor beeped. Then again, stronger. 7:30 p.m., 20 hours post-surgery. The critical moment came as sunset painted the hospital windows golden. Both patients' rooms filled with emergency staff as their conditions simultaneously deteriorated. "We're losing them both," Dr. Chen announced grimly. "It's like they're linked somehow." Then Tommy spoke up from the doorway, moved them together. The medical team hesitated, but at this point they had nothing to lose. With careful coordination, they moved Sullivan's bed next to Ivy's. The effect was immediate and inexplicable. Both patients' vital signs began to strengthen. Their heart rhythms, displayed on adjacent monitors, gradually synchronized. 9:45 p.m., 22 hours post-surgery. Dr. Chen and Dr. Reynolds stood at the nurse's station, reviewing the miraculous turnaround in their patients' conditions. "Medically, it makes no sense," Dr. Reynolds admitted, "but then nothing about this case has followed the rules." Through the ICU window, they could see Sullivan and Ivy, uncle and niece, their beds still side by side. The street children had been allowed to stay, keeping a quiet vigil. Richard sat between the beds, one hand holding his father's, the other touching Ivy's blanket. "Maybe," Dr. Chen suggested, "some things are stronger than medical science. Some connections go deeper than blood." 11:59 p.m., 24 hours post-surgery. The critical period was ending. Both patients had stabilized, their vital signs strong and steady. The kidney was functioning, Sullivan's heart had found its rhythm, and the impossible had become possible. As the clock struck midnight, Ivy's fingers twitched. Then slowly her eyes opened. Her first words, barely a whisper, "Is he okay?" Even in that moment, her first thought was for others. The night nurse smiled through tears. "Yes, dear, your uncle's right beside you. You both made it." Dawn would bring new challenges, but for now, in the quiet of the ICU, two hearts beat in sync, and two souls, one who had everything and gave it away, one who had nothing but gave it all, had found their way back to life together. The morning sun painted Manhattan's skyline in shades of gold when both Sullivan and Ivy fully regained consciousness. The medical staff called it a miracle, but those who witnessed it understood it was something more, a testament to the power of unconditional love and sacrifice. Dr. Chen entered Ivy's room first, where she was already trying to sit up despite her weakness. Her first coherent sentence captured everything about her character. The children. Did someone make sure they got breakfast? In the next bed, Sullivan stirred at the sound of her voice. Despite his own critical condition, he turned his head toward her. Their eyes met for the first time since the surgery, uncle and niece, both forever changed by their shared sacrifice. "You're still worried about everyone else." Sullivan's voice was weak but carried a note of wonder. "Even now?" Ivy managed a small smile. "Isn't that what family does?" The word family hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of everything they'd discovered. Richard, who had been dozing in a chair between their beds, awoke to this exchange. "The children are fine," he assured them both. "They've been fed, clothed, and given proper medical checkups. I think I finally understand what Aunt Claire meant about true wealth." The room filled with morning light as Dr. Reynolds entered to check on Sullivan's heart. The monitors showed something remarkable. His heart rhythm had strengthened beyond their expectations. "It's as if the act of giving literally healed your heart," she marveled, studying the readings. "Medically, it makes no sense, but love rarely does," Ivy finished softly. The street children had maintained their vigil outside the ICU windows. When they saw both patients awake, they pressed their faces against the glass, their breath fogging the surface. Tommy led them in a quiet psalm when Ivy had taught them about hope and perseverance. A nurse brought in Claire's diary, found in the hospital records. Sullivan held it with trembling hands as Ivy read aloud from her mother's last entry. "My dearest brother, if you're reading this, it means Ivy has found her way back to you. Remember when we were children, and you said giving makes the heart stronger? You were right then. I pray you'll remember that truth again." Sullivan's eyes filled with tears. "I forgot so much, Claire," he whispered, "but your daughter taught me to remember." The medical team gathered for morning rounds, astonished by the recovery rates of both patients. Dr. Chen shared his observations. "The kidney is functioning perfectly better than we dared hope, and Mr. Sullivan's heart. Well, we're seeing something unprecedented. The strain of surgery should have weakened it, but instead, Dr. Reynolds continued, it's showing signs of actually strengthening. The damaged areas are healing at a remarkable rate." Richard had been quiet, watching this miracle unfold. Finally, he spoke. "I've already started implementing the changes. Every child from Ivy's street family has been given full medical care. We're converting the East Wing into a free clinic, just like Aunt Claire wanted." Sullivan reached for his son's hand. "You're doing what I should have done years ago." "We both are," Richard replied, then turned to Ivy. "Cousin, thank you for showing us what we'd forgotten." The miracle wasn't just in their physical recovery. Throughout the hospital, change was spreading like ripples in a pond. Nurses who had once turned away the uninsured now fought to help them. Doctors who had prioritized profit began offering pro bono services. By midday, news crews had gathered outside the hospital, drawn by the extraordinary story. But the real miracle was happening inside, in quiet moments and small gestures. An elderly woman brought soup she had made herself, not for the wealthy CEO, but for the homeless girl who had given her last coins for medicine. The other street children shared their hospital meals with visiting reporters, showing that generosity isn't bound by circumstance. Late in the afternoon, as golden light filled the ICU, Sullivan asked to have his bed moved closer to Ivy's. When they were side by side, he took her hand. "Claire knew," he said softly. "She knew you would be the one to save me, not just my life, but my soul." Ivy squeezed his hand. "We saved each other. That's what family does. Tommy, allowed a brief visit, brought something he'd been saving, a crumpled photograph found in Ivy's cardboard box. It showed Claire holding baby Ivy, their smiles mirror images of each other. "See," Tommy said, placing the photo where they both could see it. "You've always been rich in the things that matter." As evening approached, Dr. Chen made his final rounds. The medical charts showed something unprecedented. Both patients were healing at rates that defied explanation. But looking at them together, the uncle who had given everything to save a life, the niece who had risked her life to save his soul, he understood that some miracles can't be measured by medical science. "You've changed this hospital," he told them. "You've changed all of us." Outside their window, the city lights began to twinkle. In the hospital lobby, Richard was reviewing plans for the new Claire Martinez Memorial Wing. The street children had been given beds in a converted conference room, their first safe sleep in years. The miracle wasn't just survival. It was transformation of hearts, of minds, of an entire institution. It was the proof that Claire had been right all along. True healing begins with love. Dear viewers, each story we share is a heartbeat of human connection, a reminder of the extraordinary power of compassion and love. Your support through subscribing means more than just numbers. It helps us continue sharing these touching narratives that remind us of our shared humanity. If this story of sacrifice, redemption, and unconditional love has moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Together, we can spread more stories that illuminate the best of human nature, reminding us that in a world often divided by wealth and status, the richest currency is still the kindness we share. Thank you for being part of this journey. In the days following the miraculous surgery, both Sullivan and Ivy faced their own unique battles. The physical recovery was challenging enough, but the emotional aftermath proved even more complex. For Ivy, the transition from street survival to hospital care was jarring. She would wake in panic at night, forgetting where she was, her hands instinctively reaching for the younger children she'd protected for so long. The soft hospital bed felt uncomfortably luxurious compared to her cardboard box, and the constant attention from nurses made her anxious. "You need to eat more," the nutritionist would insist, presenting carefully balanced meals. But Ivy would look at the full plate and ask, "Could you divide this? The kids in the shelter wing, they need it more than I do." Sullivan's struggle was different. His body was healing remarkably well, but the weight of his past decisions haunted him. Each time he saw a new homeless person admitted to the free clinic, he wondered how many others had been turned away over the years. The faces of those they'd rejected now visited him in dreams. One morning, a nurse found him weeping quietly in his room. "What's wrong, Mr. Sullivan? Are you in pain?" He shook his head. "I just remembered. Last winter, we turned away a young mother with pneumonia. She died in the parking lot. She could have been another Claire. Her child could have been another Ivy." The recovery floor became a strange mixing ground of social classes. Wealthy board members would arrive with expensive gifts for both patients, only to find the street children already there, offering treasures of their own: a found flower, a carefully drawn picture, a song learned on the streets. Richard found himself navigating between these worlds, learning from both. He spent mornings in board meetings, implementing the hospital's new policies, and afternoons sitting with the street children, listening to their stories. "Tell me about my cousin," he would ask them. "Tell me about the Ivy you know." Their stories painted a portrait of quiet heroism: Ivy sharing her last bite of food, teaching younger kids to read using discarded newspapers, standing up to bullies despite her small size. Each tale made Richard more determined to honor her legacy. Physical therapy sessions became daily challenges. Sullivan, once used to commanding boardrooms, now struggled to walk the hospital corridor. But he refused to give up, drawing strength from watching Ivy's determination in the next room. "She never complains," his therapist remarked. "Even when I can see it hurts." "She's teaching me," Sullivan replied, pushing himself to take one more step. "She's teaching all of us." The hardest moments came during the nights. Both patients suffered from nightmares, Ivy reliving the bus impact, Sullivan dreaming of Claire's accident. Often they would find themselves awake at the same time, sharing quiet conversations across their adjoining rooms. "Do you think she'd be proud?" Sullivan asked one night, meaning Claire. "She is proud," Ivy answered simply. "She's been watching over both of us all along." The street children continued their vigil, but in a new way. They'd been enrolled in the hospital's new education program, learning basic health care alongside their regular studies. During breaks, they would visit Ivy, proudly showing her their progress. "Look, Ivy," Tommy would exclaim. "I can read the medicine labels now. I can help others." But recovery wasn't linear. There were setbacks, days when Ivy's body showed signs of rejecting the kidney, hours when Sullivan's heart rhythm became erratic. During these moments, the entire hospital seemed to hold its breath. Like Richard would whisper, watching both monitors, "You've come too far to give up now." And they did fight, drawing strength from each other and from the community that had formed around them. The wealthy learned from the poor found dignity in their wisdom, and the hospital began to heal along with its patients. 1 month into their recovery, Dr. Chen found Ivy sitting up in bed, teaching one of the younger street children to read using her medical chart. "You should be resting," he admonished gently. Ivy looked up with Claire's smile. "This is resting. Besides, healing others helps us heal ourselves, doesn't it?" Looking at his changed hospital, at the mixed crowd of rich and poor in the waiting rooms, at the new spirit of compassion that pervaded every corridor, Dr. Chen couldn't disagree. The truth emerged not in a single dramatic moment, but in pieces, like a puzzle slowly assembling itself. It began when Sarah Chen discovered more of Claire's personal effects in the hospital archives, including a security camera footage from the night Sarah Martinez had been turned away. The footage showed Sarah Martinez, Ivy's adoptive mother, pleading at the emergency room desk. "Please," she begged, "I used to work here. I was Claire Sullivan's friend." But the policy had been clear: no insurance, no admission. The camera caught Sullivan himself walking past, too absorbed in a profit report to notice the dying woman who had once helped save his niece. When Sullivan watched this footage from his hospital bed, his hands trembled. "I walked right past her," he whispered. "I didn't even look up. I could have saved her. I could have saved Ivy from years on the street." But there was more. Among Claire's belongings was a letter addressed to Sarah Martinez, dated just before the accident. "Dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. Keep Ivy safe from the world of wealth that destroyed my brother's compassion. Let her learn the value of kindness before she learns the value of money. When the time is right, the truth will find its way home. With love and trust, Claire." Sarah Martinez had honored that request until her dying breath, choosing to live in poverty rather than seek help from the Sullivans. She had raised Ivy with Claire's values, teaching her that true wealth lay in what you gave, not what you had. The revelation hit Sullivan hard. "I killed them both," he said to Richard one evening. Claire, trying to protect her child from what I'd become. Sarah, trying to honor Claire's wishes. My greed orphaned Ivy twice. Richard, who had been examining old hospital records, made another discovery. The policy changes that had led to refusing emergency care had been implemented exactly 1 month after Claire's death, as if Sullivan had hardened his heart against the very thing that had taken his sister. "It was easier to turn them away if I didn't look at their faces," Sullivan confessed. "Easier to talk about profit margins than human cost." When Ivy learned the full truth, her reaction surprised everyone. Instead of anger, she showed understanding that brought tears to the hardened nurse's eyes. "Mom, Sarah, she used to say that hurt people," Ivy said softly. You were hurting so much after losing Claire that you built walls around your heart. But walls can come down. Look at us now." The street children, hearing the story, added their own wisdom. Tommy spoke up. "Ivy always told us that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past, it's about choosing a different future." But the hardest truth emerged when they found Claire's final ultrasound. The doctor's notes confirmed Sullivan's worst fear: if she had received immediate medical care after the accident, both she and the baby might have survived. His own hospital's policies, implemented even before her death, had contributed to the delay that killed her. Sullivan spent a night in deep despair after this revelation. But in the morning, Ivy wheeled herself to his room. "Uncle Marcus," she said, using the title for the first time, "Mom chose Sarah to raise me because she believed in the power of love to teach truth. She knew that someday we would all find our way back to what matters." The truth became a catalyst for deeper change. Sullivan ordered a complete audit of every case the hospital had turned away. Each story would be acknowledged, each family contacted. The Claire Martinez Memorial Foundation would offer compensation, but more importantly, it would offer healing. "We can't change the past," Sullivan announced to the board, "but we can honor it by changing the future." As these truths came to light, something remarkable happened. Instead of destroying the hospital's reputation, the honesty enhanced it. People began coming forward with their own stories, creating a tapestry of testimony that would guide the institution's transformation. Richard, watching his father and cousin navigate these revelations together, understood finally what his Aunt Claire had tried to teach them: all that truth, however painful, was the first step toward healing. "We're not just treating bodies anymore," he told the hospital staff. "We're healing histories, reconnecting hearts, rebuilding trust." The truth had cost them their comfortable illusions, but it had given them something far more valuable: a chance at redemption, a way to honor both Claire's sacrifice and Sarah's dedication by creating the kind of hospital they had both dreamed of. The battle for forgiveness proved to be the most challenging part of recovery, fought not in operating rooms but in the quiet chambers of the heart. For Sullivan, forgiving himself seemed impossible as each new revelation added weight to his burden of guilt. One snowy afternoon, exactly like the day of the bus accident, he sat by his window watching snowflakes fall. Each one seemed to carry a memory of those he'd failed: Claire, Sarah Martinez, countless unnamed others turned away by his policies. "How do you do it?" he asked Ivy, who had wheeled herself into his room. "How do you forgive so easily?" Ivy was quiet for a moment, watching the snow with him. "It's not easy," she finally said, "but Mum Sarah taught me something important. She said forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, it's about making room for a different future." But the battle raged within Sullivan. During physical therapy sessions, each step felt weighted with guilt. At night, his dreams were haunted by faces: Claire's last smile, Sarah Martinez's desperate plea at the emergency room, Ivy sleeping in her cardboard box through winter storms. Richard watched his father's struggle, feeling his own battle with forgiveness. He'd been complicit in everything, had even championed stricter policies to improve profit margins. "I don't deserve forgiveness either," he confessed to Ivy one evening. "I saw the suffering and looked away." Ivy took his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "The hardest person to forgive is yourself," she said, "but that's where healing has to start." The street children, in their wisdom born of hardship, became unexpected teachers of forgiveness. They shared their stories during evening visits, tales of abandonment, abuse, survival. Yet each story ended not with bitterness but with hope. "Ivy taught us," Tommy explained, "that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die." The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A former patient who had been turned away years ago arrived at the hospital. Instead of anger, she brought understanding. "I was bitter for years," she told Sullivan, "but watching your transformation, seeing how you and Ivy have changed this place, that's worth more than any revenge." Her forgiveness cracked something in Sullivan's armored heart. That night he wept for the first time since Claire's death, deep, healing tears that washed away years of carefully constructed walls. Ivy found him in this state and simply held his hand, offering the same comfort she'd given countless street children on cold nights. "Claire would be proud," she whispered. "Not because you're perfect, but because you're trying to be better." The battle for forgiveness spread throughout the hospital. Staff members who had enforced the old policies struggled with their own guilt. Board members who had prioritized profit faced their complicity in suffering. Richard led by example, publicly acknowledging his past mistakes and committing to change. He worked alongside the street children, learning their stories, understanding the human cost of cold policies. Forgiveness, he realized, isn't just about the past. It's about creating a future worth believing in. The hardest moment came when they visited Sarah Martinez's grave. Sullivan knelt in the snow, placing flowers beside the simple headstone. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry I forgot what Claire tried to teach us. I'm sorry I failed you both." Ivy stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "Mom would say you haven't failed until you stop trying to make things right." The snow fell softly around them, like tears from heaven, as uncle and niece stood together at the grave of the woman who had sacrificed everything to honor Claire's wishes. Later that evening, back in their hospital rooms, Sullivan made a decision. He asked for Claire's diary to be brought to him. "Dear Claire," he wrote on the final blank page, "I'm learning to forgive myself. Not because I deserve it, but because holding on to guilt dishonors the love you and Sarah showed us. Your daughter is teaching me what you tried to, that true wealth lies in the capacity to love, to give, to forgive, to forgive." As winter began to thaw outside their windows, something thawed in their hearts too. The battle for forgiveness wasn't won in a single moment, but in small victories, in Sullivan's genuine smile when holding a homeless child, in Richard's patient kindness with difficult cases, in Ivy's quiet strength as she helped others heal while healing herself. Perhaps Dr. Chen observed one evening, watching the transformed hospital at work, forgiveness is like medicine. The right dose, given with love, can heal what seems unhealable. The battle would never be completely over, but they were learning to fight it together, creating a legacy of healing that went far beyond physical medicine. The DNA results arrived on a quiet morning in early spring. Dr. Chen brought them personally to the recovery ward where Sullivan and Ivy were now able to sit together in the small garden area, watching the first flowers push through the melting snow. "The tests confirm it beyond any doubt," he announced. "You are Claire Sullivan's daughter, Ivy. But there's more." He handed them a second set of papers, genetic markers that told a deeper story. Ivy's DNA showed a rare genetic variation, one that made her an unusually perfect match for organ donation to someone with Sullivan's specific heart condition. "It's statistically impossible," Dr. Chen explained. "This kind of compatibility between uncle and niece, it's as if Claire knew," Sullivan finished softly. "As if she somehow knew her daughter would one day need to save her brother." The revelation sparked a deeper exploration of family connections. Sarah Chen brought more of Claire's personal effects, photographs, letters, and most significantly, her medical research notebooks. Claire, they discovered, hadn't just been fighting for hospital policy changes. She'd been conducting genetic research, studying hereditary heart conditions in the Sullivan family. Her notes revealed she'd known about her brother's developing heart problems long before he did. "Look at this," Richard said, reading from one of Claire's journals. She wrote, "Marcus's heart condition is progressing, though he refuses to acknowledge it. The same stubbornness that makes him an excellent businessman may one day cost him his life. Unless love can save him first." The street children, now a permanent part of their extended family, added their own perspective on connection. Tommy spoke up during one of their daily visits. "Ivy always said we don't need blood to be family, we just need love. But now you have both." Photos from Claire's collection showed a deeper timeline of connection. There was Claire with Sarah Martinez at medical conferences, both passionate about healthcare accessibility. There were surveillance photos of young Ivy, taken discreetly over the years. Claire had arranged for someone to keep watch over her daughter from afar. "She never really left us," Ivy whispered, touching the photos gently. She was making sure we'd find each other when the time was right. The most powerful connection emerged through the hospital staff stories. Nurses remembered Claire's kindness, her secret work with uninsured patients. Maintenance workers recalled her learning their names, asking about their families. She had woven a web of compassion that survived her death. One elderly janitor brought them a faded Polaroid Claire, heavily pregnant, sitting with young Richard, reading him stories in the hospital garden. She used to say, the janitor recalled, "That family isn't just who you're born to, it's who you choose to love." Richard stared at the photo, remembering moments he'd forgotten. "She would bring me here when Dad was busy with meetings. She taught me all the flower names." The connection wasn't just in the past. As Sullivan and Ivy recovered together, their bond grew stronger. They discovered shared mannerisms, similar laughs, the same instinctive gesture when deep in thought, all echoes of Claire. But perhaps the most profound connection was in their shared vision for the future. Together, they began planning the hospital's transformation, combining Sullivan's business acumen with Ivy's street-learned wisdom about what people really needed. "Claire would love this," Sullivan said one evening, watching Ivy teach young patients in the children's ward. She always said hospitals should heal more than just bodies. The DNA results had confirmed their blood connection, but the real family ties were being forged in these moments of shared purpose, shared vision, shared love. "Family," Ivy told the street children gathered around her bed, "is about who stands by you when standing is hardest. Sometimes it takes years to find each other, but love always finds a way home." As spring bloomed outside the hospital windows, the full extent of the past began to unravel like a carefully wound spool of thread. Sarah Chen's investigation had uncovered a complex web of events that stretched back decades, revealing how one moment of hardened hearts had created ripples of consequence through countless lives. The pivotal discovery came in the form of an old security recording, dated the night of Claire's accident. The grainy footage showed something shocking. Claire's car hadn't simply lost control. Another vehicle had forced her off the road, a black sedan registered to one of the hospital board members who had opposed her free healthcare initiatives. "It wasn't an accident," Richard whispered, watching the footage. "They silenced her because she threatened their profit margins." Sullivan sat heavily in his wheelchair, the weight of this revelation crushing him. "I was so blind. While I worried about stock prices, they murdered my sister." Further investigation revealed a darker pattern. The policy changes that had turned away Sarah Martinez and countless others hadn't originated with Sullivan at all. A small group of board members had manipulated hospital data, presenting skewed figures that made their harsh policies seem necessary. "Look at these real numbers," Sarah Chen explained, spreading documents across Sullivan's bed. "The free clinic Claire proposed would have actually increased overall revenue through government grants and private donations. They buried her research because it threatened their control." Ivy, listening from her adjacent bed, understood something profound. So Uncle Marcus wasn't just fighting his own heart, he was fighting against a system that had been rigged from the start. The unraveling continued. Employee testimonies began pouring in. Nurses who had been threatened with dismissal if they helped non-paying patients, doctors whose research into affordable care options had mysteriously disappeared, administrators who had been pressured to falsify reports. One elderly board member, dying of cancer, made a full confession. He detailed how they had orchestrated Claire's accident, arranged for her baby to disappear into the system, and systematically destroyed evidence of their corruption. "We thought we were protecting the hospital's interests," he wheezed, "but we were destroying its soul." Richard took charge of the legal response, working with prosecutors to build cases against those responsible. But it was Ivy who suggested a different approach to justice. Instead of just punishment, she proposed, let's use their money to fund what Mom wanted: free clinics, research into affordable care, support for homeless patients. The unraveling of the past became a blueprint for the future. Each revealed deception pointed the way toward a specific reform. Every uncovered lie became a foundation for a new truth. Sullivan watched this transformation with a mixture of grief and hope. Claire knew, he said softly one evening. She knew they would try to stop her. That's why she arranged for Sarah Martinez to raise you, Ivy. She was protecting you from the same system that killed her. The most poignant discovery came last: a video Claire had recorded the day before her death. In it, she spoke directly to her unborn child. My darling, if you're watching this, you found your way back to the hospital. I hope it's different now. I hope someone remembered that healing isn't just a business. And if it isn't different yet, then maybe you're the one meant to change it. As these truths came to light, the hospital itself seemed to exhale, as if relieved to finally shed its burden of secrets. Staff members walked taller, worked with renewed purpose. The very atmosphere changed from one of corporate sterility to genuine healing. The past had unraveled, but instead of destroying them, it had shown them exactly how to rebuild. Every exposed lie pointed toward a new truth. Every revealed deception showed them where healing was most needed. The process of reconciliation began in the hospital's old boardroom, now transformed into a community gathering space. Sullivan and Ivy sat at the head of the table, no longer just patient and savior, but family united by truth and tested by fire. We can't change what happened, Sullivan addressed the assembled group: board members, street children, medical staff, and former patients. But we can change what happens next. The room was thick with emotion as people began to share their stories. A nurse confessed to years of turning away patients, her voice breaking as she described the faces that haunted her dreams. A former board member admitted to prioritizing profits over people, his expensive suit no longer a shield against his conscience. Ivy, still wearing her hospital gown but radiating quiet strength, spoke about forgiveness. My mothers, both of them, taught me that reconciliation isn't about forgetting. It's about building something new from the pieces of what was broken. The street children, now clean and cared for, shared their perspectives. Tommy spoke about nights spent in the cold, but also about the kindness they'd found in unexpected places. Each story was a thread, weaving together a new fabric of understanding. Richard stood to make his own confession. I was wrong about everything that mattered. Wealth isn't what's in our accounts, it's what's in our hearts. The reconciliation extended beyond the boardroom. Throughout the hospital, walls were literally and metaphorically coming down. The private suites were being converted into family rooms where homeless patients could recover with dignity. The exclusive executive dining room became a community kitchen where former street children learned culinary skills alongside top chefs. Sullivan watched it all with tears in his eyes. Claire would have loved this, he said softly. This is what she died trying to create. The most powerful moment came when they gathered to rename the hospital. The new sign would read the Claire Martinez Memorial Hospital, where everyone heals. As spring flowers bloomed in the hospital garden, uncle and niece sat together, watching the sunrise paint the city gold. They had found each other through sacrifice, been united by truth, and now were bound by a shared vision of healing not just bodies, but hearts and communities. What happens now? Ivy asked, her hand in her uncle's. Sullivan smiled, seeing Claire's hope in his niece's eyes. Now we keep our promises. To your mother, to the community, to each other. The reconciliation wasn't perfect or complete. Some wounds would take generations to heal. But they had made a start, creating a place where healing meant more than just medical care, where wealth was measured in compassion rather than currency. As they sat there, the morning sun warming their faces, They could almost feel Claire's presence in the gentle breeze, in the blooming flowers, in the laughter of children playing in what had once been a cold, corporate space. They had reconciled not just with each other, but with the past itself. And in doing so, they had created something Claire had always dreamed of, a place where everyone, regardless of their circumstances, could find healing for body and soul alike. The transformation of Sullivan Memorial into the Claire Martinez Memorial Hospital happened both overnight and gradually, like a sunrise that changes everything while you're watching it unfold. 1 year after the fateful bus accident, the changes were remarkable. The imposing glass lobby, once a monument to corporate healthcare, now featured a wall-sized mural painted by former street children. It depicted Claire's story, Ivy's journey, and the hospital's transformation, ending with an image of hands joined in healing, rich and poor, young and old, all connected. Every morning when I walk in, Sullivan told the board during their final meeting in the old format, I see what we almost lost and what we found again. The most visible transformation was physical. The hospital's East Wing became a free clinic operating 24/7. The executive offices were converted into family housing units for long-term patients and their loved ones. The once sterile corridors now bloomed with artwork and color. But the deeper transformation was in the hospital's soul. Ivy, fully recovered and now heading the Claire Martinez Foundation, had implemented what they called the Street Wisdom Program. Former homeless individuals were trained as patient advocates, using their hard-earned life experience to help others navigate the healthcare system. Who better to help the forgotten, she explained, than those who remember what it's like to be invisible? Tommy, his leg finally properly treated, became the first graduate of their new medical training program for underprivileged youth. He specialized in pediatric care, his crutches now a badge of empathy rather than hardship. Richard underwent perhaps the most surprising transformation. The man who had once fought to protect profits now worked tirelessly to expand access to care. He sold his luxury penthouse, using the proceeds to fund medical scholarships for homeless youth. Wealth, he often said, quoting his cousin, is measured by what you give, not what you keep. The hospital's financial transformation defied conventional wisdom. While profit margins decreased, community support soared. Donations poured in, inspired by the hospital's new mission. Doctors and nurses took voluntary pay cuts, compensated instead by the satisfaction of unrestricted healing. Sullivan himself changed most visibly. The corporate suits gave way to casual clothes that made him approachable to all patients. His office door, once guarded by secretaries, now stood open to anyone seeking help. Each morning, he and Ivy would walk the halls together, greeting patients by name, listening to their stories. The transformation reached beyond the hospital walls. Other medical institutions began studying their model. The Claire Principle, as it became known, proved that compassionate care could be financially sustainable. One snowy morning, exactly 1 year after the accident, Sullivan stood at his office window. Below, he could see the spot where Ivy had saved his life. Now it was marked by a small garden where patients could sit and find peace. Uncle Marcus Ivy's voice came from the doorway. She still called him that, though they'd grown as close as father and daughter. The new pediatric center is ready. They walked together to what had once been the hospital's most exclusive private wing. Now it was a bright, welcoming space filled with children's laughter. The sign above the door read the Sarah Martinez Children's Center, where every child matters. Mom would have loved this, Ivy said softly, watching a former street child reading to younger patients. Sullivan squeezed her hand. Both your mothers would be proud. Claire's vision, Sarah's nurturing, they live on in everything you do. The transformation wasn't complete. Transformation never is. But they had created something remarkable, a place where healing transcended medicine, where worth wasn't measured by wealth, where every life mattered equally. You know what the best transformation is? Sullivan asked, watching the sunrise paint the city gold. What? Hope. People come here now, not just expecting to be healed, but knowing they'll be cared for. That's what Claire wanted all along. And in the morning light, the hospital stood transformed, not just a building of brick and steel, but a testament to the power of love to change everything it touches. The impact of the Claire Martinez Memorial Hospital's transformation rippled through society like stones cast in still water, creating changes that no one could have predicted. Within 18 months, the effects were visible across the city and beyond. The most immediate impact was on the homeless community. The hospital's comprehensive care program didn't just treat immediate medical needs, it provided pathways out of poverty. Former critics who had filmed Ivy's humiliation in the restaurant now watched in silence as their viral videos were replaced by news stories of successful rehabilitation programs. Remember that girl you mocked Tommy would ask during his presentations at medical conferences? She created a system that saved thousands of lives, including some of yours. He was right. Several of the restaurant's former patrons had found themselves seeking care at the hospital after other facilities turned them away during financial hardships. The same people who had once laughed at Ivy's desperation now experienced the dignity of care without judgment. The social media influencer who had started the Lebanon beggar hashtag made a public apology after his mother received life-saving treatment at the hospital's free clinic. His new viral campaign, Compassion Heals, helped raise millions for similar programs nationwide. Lebanon itself underwent a transformation. Shamed by the contrast between their past behavior and the hospital's example, they established a program serving high-quality meals to homeless families. Amanda, the waitress who had spilled soup on Ivy, now volunteered there. Her perspective forever changed. Ivy taught us that true service isn't about who you serve, she said in a local news interview, but how you serve them. The impact on the medical community was revolutionary. Other hospitals began adopting the Claire model, discovering that compassionate care could coexist with financial stability. Medical schools revised their curricula to include modules on empathy and social responsibility, taught by former street children who had become healthcare advocates. Richard's transformation became a case study in business schools. The Sullivan shift, they called it, how prioritizing social impact over profit could actually improve both. He traveled nationally, sharing their story and helping other institutions implement similar changes. The Street Children's Education Program became a model for social services nationwide. Those who had once been invisible became leaders, teachers, and healers. Tommy's medical training program expanded to 5 other cities, each graduate carrying forward the lesson that experience of hardship could become a source of healing wisdom. Perhaps the most profound impact was on the city's wealthy elite. The same board members who had once opposed free care now competed to fund new initiatives. Their children, inspired by Ivy's story, created scholarship programs for homeless youth. We measure success differently now, one former opponent admitted during a fundraising gala. Not by what we earn, but by what we give. The hospital's waiting room became a powerful symbol of social change. CEOs sat beside homeless individuals, all receiving the same level of care and respect. The barriers between social classes didn't disappear entirely, but they became more permeable, more human. Former critics found themselves transformed by their own experiences at the hospital. The journalist who had once written scathing editorials about enabling freeloaders published a series about the hidden costs of inequality after his own family received care during a financial crisis. Even the physical neighborhood around the hospital changed. New businesses opened, not high-end boutiques, but community-focused enterprises that served everyone. The park where Ivy had once slept became a healing garden, its benches bearing plaques with Claire's wisdom about the true nature of wealth. Sullivan and Ivy watched these changes with quiet joy, knowing that each small transformation contributed to a larger healing. The society that had once been sharply divided into those who mattered and those who didn't was slowly learning to see the humanity in everyone. The real miracle, Ivy told a graduating class of medical students, isn't just in healing bodies. It's in healing the wounds we create when we forget we're all connected. The impact continued to spread, proving that one act of sacrifice, born of love, could transform not just individuals but the very fabric of society itself. On a crisp winter morning, exactly 2 years after the bus accident, snow began falling on Manhattan once again. Sullivan and Ivy stood in the cemetery, fresh flowers in their hands, visiting 2 graves that now lay side by side: Claire Sullivan and Sarah Martinez, finally reunited. "They were both right," Ivy said softly, brushing snow from the headstones. "Mom Claire knew that love could heal anything, even a broken system. And Mom Sarah showed me that true wealth isn't in what you have, but in what you give." Sullivan wrapped his coat around her shoulders, the same expensive coat he'd once used to keep her warm after the accident. Now it was a reminder of how far they'd come, how much they'd both changed. "Look," he pointed through the falling snow. Coming up the path was a procession they hadn't expected, Tommy leading a group of former street children, now medical students and healthcare workers. Behind them came Richard, hospital staff, and even some of the former board members who had opposed their changes. They gathered around the graves, each carrying a single white rose. Tommy stepped forward first, his medical student badge gleaming. "We came to say thank you," he said, to both of them. Claire for planting the seeds of change, and Sarah for nurturing them in Ivy. One by one they laid their roses on the graves. Each person shared a brief story: lives saved at the free clinic, families reunited, barriers broken down. The snow fell around them like a gentle blessing, transforming the scene into something almost magical. Richard stepped forward last, holding not flowers but Claire's old diary. "I thought it was time for this to come full circle," he said, opening to the final page where Sullivan had written his promise 2 years ago. Below it, they each wrote their own promises, commitments to carry forward the legacy of love and healing that Claire and Sarah had begun. The diary would be displayed in the hospital lobby, its pages a testament to the power of transformation. As the group began to disperse, Sullivan and Ivy remained behind. The snow was falling harder now, reminding them of that fateful day. But this time the cold carried no bite. They were surrounded by warmth that no winter could touch. "Uncle Marcus," Ivy said, taking his hand, "do you think they knew that all of this would happen?" Sullivan looked at the graves of his sister and the woman who had protected her child, then at the retreating figures of their extended family, this beautiful, unlikely community they'd built together. "Claire always said that love finds a way," he replied. Maybe this was the way it found. They turned to leave, but Ivy paused for one last look. In the swirling snow, she could almost see them, Claire and Sarah, smiling with pride at what their love had created. "Ready to go home?" Sullivan asked. Ivy nodded, squeezing his hand. "Yes, we have rounds to make, patients to see, lives to change." As they walked away, their footprints filling with fresh snow, the cemetery fell quiet. But it was a peaceful quiet, full of promise. Above the graves, someone had placed a small plaque with words from Claire's diary. "True healing begins when we remember that every life has equal worth, and every heart has equal capacity for love. In the end, we are all just walking each other home." The snow continued to fall, covering everything in pristine white, a clean slate, a new beginning, a promise kept. This story deserves your subscription, doesn't it? Please click the subscribe button, like and share with your family, and don't forget to share your lessons learned and thoughts in the comments below. Once again, our team extends our deepest gratitude to our valued audience for following and supporting this channel. Your engagement helps us continue sharing these touching stories that remind us of the power of love, forgiveness, and the true meaning of wealth. Together, we can spread more meaningful narratives that touch hearts and transform lives. Thank you for being part of this journey of hope and healing.